Scott, it's great to see you again. The last time we sat down to talk to each other, it was 9 years ago. That was for the Exorcism of Emily Rose.
Wow, good to be back.
I just have to say that I almost regret having watched that film with my wife, Suzanne. She wants you to know that she's been scarred for life. I can't even tell you how many conversations I've had with her around 3 a.m.
Right. Yeah. It's sadly that gives me joy. So I apologize and am grateful.
What does a nice Christian guy like you see in this genre? What does horror at its best offer us?
I mean, many things depending on the movie. For me, it's the perfect genre for a person of faith to work in. You know, you can think about good and evil pretty openly and pretty directly. I think I always talk about it being the genre of non-denial. You know, which for me makes it interesting in that Christians are not known for open-mindedness. A lot of times we are people who live in denial of certain things, and I like the fact that it's a genre that's about confronting evil, confronting what scares us, confronting what it makes us afraid, what's frightening in the world, and doing it honestly. There's that. I think that's half of it for me. The other half of it is that I like the mystery of the genre, that it's a genre that takes the mystery of the world really seriously. And there's a lot of voices in the world that are broadcasting that the world is explainable. You know, corporate America limits the world to consumerism. Science limits it to the material world. And you know, even religion limits it to a lot of theories that ultimately can explain everything. And I think we need cinema to break that apart and remind us that we're not in control and we don't understand as much as we think we do. And I think it's a desire to stay in touch with that makes me love the genre, because when I am in touch with that, the world's a much more magical place to live in.
What about the flip side of the coin, the potential pitfalls or the downside of horror as a genre? And I'm not talking just about like the most gruesome or the worst excesses of the genre, but how can the genre go wrong, or how can we go wrong watching it? Are there any concerns in that direction?
Yeah, sure. You know, I mean, it's true. There are concerns for every genre. You know, things that you can do wrong, and that can, you know, action can become mere stimulus and mere distraction. And when an action film is reduced to that, I'm not sure how good or healthy that is, at least in large quantities, you know. And I think that horror is the same way, that when it's reduced to mere scariness and nothing but fear, or even worse, mere exploitation, there's even a measure of that I think can be a part of any healthy cinematic diet. But when it's primarily reduced to that, or when there's too many of those films being made, or when an individual watches too many movies that are just like that, I don't think it's necessarily a good or healthy thing, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, you know. And horror, for me at least, in the movies that I love the most, invites depth and invites moral passion, and invites ideas that are to be taken seriously. And I think as long as horror is doing that, you're in the higher realm of what it can and should do.
It's interesting to me that you've raised those themes of balance and how much of something is happening and whether things are in proportion to one another. As a film critic, I try to think seriously about the long-term impact on me of the things that I expose myself to. I don't think any one film is going to destroy my soul, but I do take very seriously an idea that may or may not have been expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson in the words, "We become what we think about all day long." And I think of people like exorcists and priests and policemen, clinical social workers, divorce attorneys, garbage men, the people who deal with the less appealing dentists, exactly, the people who deal with all the less inspiring aspects of human existence and of the sort of occupational hazard that has on them. And I think about that for me. What about you? the movies that you make? Is that something you think about, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that a horror director or a genre film director who takes fear and the horrible seriously kind of belongs in that list of occupations that you just named, and what all of those occupations demand is a particular kind of strength, and I happen to have that particular kind of strength from when it comes to making these movies. I'm an unlikely candidate to have it because I grew up so scared. I grew up with a lot of fear, but the process of confronting fear in my own life and overcoming fear made me an unusually strong-minded person, I think, able to put my mind in places and needing in ways to put my mind in places that other minds don't go or won't go. And I think that then when it comes to the viewing of the material, everybody has to make those decisions for themselves about where their strength level is and what it does for them. The thing with horror is that it's a very individualistic experience watching a horror film, and you never know who's going to be somebody who loves it and who's not. I mean, the strongest, toughest cops I've met in New York City. There was one guy who played a major role in 9/11, part of the emergency service unit in Staten Island. That's like the main unit that comes to Manhattan in a major event like that. The lead guy there, toughest guy I've ever met, terrified of horror films. Can't watch him, and he shouldn't. If they don't do him any good, if he hates the experience, and the experience leaves him less enriched in his life, then he shouldn't watch them. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with him. At the same time, I'm never surprised when I meet some grandmother who's seen every Hellraiser movie. You just don't know, and it's a personal thing. And I think that it's important that anybody who takes cinema seriously that you don't limit yourself to just optimistic or happy movies. I think that's a problem. I think you've got to be willing to let the art of cinema and the entertainment of cinema take you into some darker places if you're going to make a full use of it in your life. But when it comes to horror, there's some people who shouldn't watch horror films, and I'm all right with that.
When you set out to construct a particular scene or you want a particular effect, you're trying to do some scary thing, would you say that it's more for you about dealing with fears that you have, or would you say that you're trying to scare yourself? How do you know when something is scary enough? And is it something that scares you? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, it is. And I think I don't think a lot of horror filmmakers work that way. I think it is one of the things that has made my work different than the work of a lot of other genre directors, is that I never approach it as though I'm standing above the audience manipulating them. Instead I'm trying to put myself through something and challenge myself with something, and that is disturbing, is frightening. And when I start to feel uncomfortable, then I know that I'm probably onto something. And when I get into something that I actually just don't want to do, I know I'm probably really where I ought to be, And the original concept for Sinister, for example, was the first time I pitched the idea to my wife, she said, "Ugh, why would anyone want to make a movie like that?" And I thought, "Oh man, I'm gonna have to make this movie," So I think, and for me, it's cathartic, I get past my fears by doing that, and it connects with audiences. They feel the same fear that I feel, and hopefully it does the same thing. It's not about putting something evil in the world. It's about putting a kind of reckoning with evil into the world, because we don't need any more evil in the world. We need a lot more reckoning with it.
It sounds to me a little like some things that G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis have said about terrifying elements in fairy tales.
Yes.
That you have dragons in order that knights can defeat them.
I think that horror, they are the dark fairy tales of pop culture. It's exactly what they are.
When I think of people who have those kinds of corrosive careers, I hope that they have some kind of remedial or restorative regimen in their lives. The garbage man goes home and takes a long hot shower. Maybe the exorcist or the confessor goes home and prays a rosary or spends some time meditating before the Blessed Sacrament. What do you have in your life that remediates for you or helps to restore you from whatever the wear and tear of the job that you do?
I mean, I have, first and foremost, my family. You know, I have two young kids, I have two young boys. I have my faith. I have a close, I have a very small handful of people that I'm very close to and that are very dear to me. And then I have music and books and cinema. You know, I have those rich things that give my life meaning. I think that when in working on movies like this, there's probably a misconception that people have that the process of doing it is burdening, and that I'm adding a sense of darkness to my life. On occasion, that's true. Like the first time that I ever did massive research on possession and exorcism, it was a horrible experience. You know, that was an experience where I saw too many videos and read too many books in too short a period of time, and I should have spread it out and slowed down a little bit. But other than a rare instance like that, my experience is that to write a horrible thing, you know, in the morning, there's something leaving me in that process. You know, there's some, and I think it's true in watching these. You know, people come out of a really good scary movie, they don't walk out thinking, oh, who am I going to go kill? You know, or they don't walk out. They usually walk out laughing. They usually walk out with something having been released. And you know, Wes Craven said horror doesn't. What was the phrase? He said horror doesn't create fear; it releases it. And I think that's true. So my point being that the process of working on these things leaves more room for light in me. You know, it is a reckoning with the evil in myself, a reckoning with the evil in the world, and having reckoned with it, suddenly I'm breathing deeper, and I can go to my kid's baseball game and I can take in the light of that more because of the confrontation with something dark. And I think that how much confrontation should a person put themselves through is very unique. I have to put myself through a lot. That's who I am. I have to put myself through a lot all the time. And I'm unusual that way. That's why I make an unusual living. You know, but I think everybody has to work out a role in their life for that, because the people who don't do that at all, they're bottling that darkness up, and it's going to come out in the worst ways.
I'm going to be walking out of this interview and going to see a movie that I'm not particularly looking forward to. I see a lot of movies that I don't enjoy, and sometimes I have to go home and watch something completely different.
Yeah.
Are there any... I know that you have horror movies that have been very influential in your life and that you look to as kind of touchstones. Any movies that are on completely the other end of the spectrum?
Oh, yeah. I mean, most of my favorite films are not horror films. And are you talking about lighter movies or just different genres? Movies
that you would look to in a more inspirational way.
Yes. Well, my very favorite film of all time is Ikiru, the Kurosawa film. That's my very favorite film, always will be. It'll never get topped by anything for a variety of reasons. And you know, it's about as gentle and beautiful and meaningful a film as a filmmaker can make. It's not a movie that I watch a lot either, because I don't want to spoil what it is. So I'm careful about when I watch that it's that kind of precious to me. But I also have you know, certain other films that are kind of the feel good, you know, inspirational films. Jerry Maguire is one of them. You know, like I can't watch that movie and not be happy. You know, it's an instant mood changer for me every time. Hoosiers is a movie I go back to a lot. I like that movie a lot. And then in terms of, there's two movies that the movies I've seen the most are still dark movies. Apocalypse Now, Blade Runner, Taxi Driver. You know, these are my favorite films. But I also have my commercial kind of distraction, popcorn, again, just get me out of myself movies, and the top two for that would be Crimson Tide and Wall Street. I can't. If those are on TV, I'm gonna watch them till the end.
Do you ever think about making a movie that's more like Ikiru than the movies that you make? Is that something you think you ever see yourself doing?
I might, I might. It's not like a dream that I have, because I think that film. I mean, I think one of the biggest mistakes that directors make, young directors or film students, people aspiring filmmakers, I should say, the biggest mistakes that aspiring filmmakers make is everybody wants to make the kinds of movies that they most admire. That is a really standard mistake, I think, that young filmmakers make, because everybody has to figure out not what they want to make, but what they're good at making. It's like when Flannery O'Connor was asked why she wrote these grotesque short stories, her answer was, because I'm good at it. Why do I make horror films? Because I'm good at it. This is what I'm good at. And so far, I have not, outside of horror and sci-fi and fantasy, and if something is not dealing with extreme imagination and mystical imagination, I don't know that I'm the right guy for it. I know that if it's dealing in that territory, there's a great range of what I can do. I can make it funnier, I can make it lighter, I can make it darker, I can make it scarier, I can make it more dramatic, more real, less real, and everything. But so far, maybe I'll grow to a place where I feel sure that I should step farther out and stretch those boundaries more. But usually it's ego that's calling for that. Usually people want to go get their respect, or whatever. And everybody wants to be Martin Scorsese, and everybody wants to be Paul Thomas Anderson, And I've consciously rejected ever feeling that way about myself, and I just try to focus on, what am I good at? What do I have the skill set for? And what can I put in front of people on their Friday and Saturday nights that they pay their hard-earned money for? That's quality, and it's good enough for them to have gotten what they paid for, And I take that responsibility really seriously. That's more important to me than feeling like I'm getting the esteem of being a celebrated filmmaker. That's meaningless.
A few exorcism films, like The Last Exorcism, have dealt with the material from a non-Catholic perspective, but not many. As Roger Ebert wrote in a review a long time ago, when it comes to fighting vampires and performing exorcisms, the Roman Catholic Church has the heavy artillery. In cases like this, you want a priest on the job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that's true? And if so, do you have any ideas about why?
First of all, hearing that, just God bless Roger Ebert. Don't we all miss him so much?
Indeed.
I had the privilege of sitting with his wife Chaz on a plane recently, random seating. It was really amazing.
Oh wow.
I think that there's some truth to it. I can't speak to vampires and crosses in holy water. Vampire mythology has never been particularly interesting to me, and I've never written a vampire movie. Don't know that I ever will. But I think that it's a couple of things. Number one, Catholicism is so steeped in imagery, and it's one of the many reasons I think that Catholicism has given birth to so many great filmmakers compared to the Protestant tradition. Even in America, where we're primarily Protestant and evangelical and all that, it's still the Catholics that are churning out the great filmmakers, and it has a lot to do with the power and potency of those images, and dark images sometimes, And I also think, though, that when it comes to the subject matter of the supernatural, for lack of a better term, I think there is a general appreciation for the fact that the Catholic Church at least is rigorous about it. That they're not hucksters selling the idea for show. And every Catholic that I've ever met who is involved in like the actual process of exorcism, they are always looking for a reason to not do it. They're always looking for a reason to discredit it. They're not looking for a reason to do it or to find it credible. They're looking for just the opposite. And I don't think that's the tendency in the Protestant tradition. So I think that's in my experience, that's the big fundamental difference.
Is that something you've tried to capture in your films?
It's not so much that it's something I've tried to capture in my films. I've just ended up making the characters I've written Catholic, for that reason.
I mean specifically with regard to that tendency to look for a reason not to believe it or not to want to do the exorcism.
I haven't explored so much that idea because in both Emily Rose and then also in Deliver Us from Evil, it's almost like that process had already happened. That process is backstory, So the two priest characters in both movies had already gone through something and already made certain determinations, so that we don't have to go through that process. Unlike the original Exorcist, which is most of the movie is about that process, and I think it's one of the reasons why I haven't done it, and probably why other filmmakers haven't done it, is because then you're stepping directly into the terrain of a movie you will never surpass. Right. So the only way to make a possession or exorcism movie is you can't top The Exorcist. You got to go under it or around it somehow. And I think I kind of went under it with Emily Rose and really went around it with this movie, and by making it a more commercial action police procedural.
You are not Catholic.
I'm not Catholic. I am, as one friend of mine once said, though. I'm one Chesterton book away from crossing the what was the river crossing the Tiber. The Tiber. It's the phrase. Yes, I am. Chesterton's my favorite writer. I'm a big fan of a lot of Catholic mystic writers. I've been deeply influenced by it. I think that the honest answer is, at this point in my life, I would become Catholic if I weren't a parent. And the only reason I don't is because my tradition is so Protestant. It's what I know. I don't know how to raise my kids Catholic, and given my life and the busyness of my life, it's something that I can't start in the at this point and do that. Maybe I will, but otherwise, I'm not sure that there's any reason for me to not make that leap. I wear a St. Francis rosary almost all the time now. There's a lot of things about Catholicism that have become increasingly important to me, and I think the number one thing for me personally about Catholicism that, aside from Chesterton's writing, the book Orthodoxy is the seminal book of ideas in my life. That book I've read more than any other book. That book is the spinal column of how I think, and how I feel about the world, and it's the spinal column that leads up to my brain and informs the way that I think and the way I perceive things. Flannery O'Connor is my favorite American writer, and Mystery and Manners is my favorite book on writing and creativity. And she said this about Catholicism. She said that Catholicism is really the only institution left in the world that protects mystery. And I think that's true. And I think it is that role that it has in the world at large that is really at the root of my current fondness for it, and the reason why, other than the fact that I don't know it well enough to bring my kids into it and raise them, and I do know how to raise them as Presbyterians, which is far less interesting, but I could do it. I could make it interesting in my own way. I have nothing but love for Catholicism. It's true.
I could definitely relate to that experience, that trajectory in your life. I was raised in the Calvinist tradition, like Presbyterianism. I was married in a Presbyterian church. I had the good fortune to be at a point in my life when I became interested in Catholicism that I wasn't yet married and I didn't yet have kids. Yeah. I was able to drag my wife along. She didn't want to become Catholic, just like she didn't want to watch Emily Rose. Right. But here we are, and we are raising our kids Catholic now. Have you ever had heebie-jeebies at 3 o'clock in the morning or something in your life that made you go, huh?
When I was, the period that I was referring to earlier, when I was watching all the exorcism videos for the first time, and I'm meeting Ralph Sarchie here in New York, it was 2003, 2004, and then it was about a 3-week period where I read about 20 books, if I remember right, on possession and exorcism. I mean, some of them from, I think it was called, what was the name of the book? There was one skeptical book that was actually really, really good, and I want to say it was American Exorcism, but I don't think that's right. Anyway, the whole range from skeptical books to Protestant books to Catholic books, and I just was filling my head with too much of it, too much in too short a period of time, and really got just an oppressed feeling about life and myself all day. It was during that time that and it was Ralph's book back then when I read it, Ralph Sarchi's book, where I read about the witching hour and 3 a.m. So that came from Ralph's book, even though I put it in Emily Rose. And I would be laying in bed, I'd be sleeping, and every single night I would just wake up, my eyes would pop open like a bell had woke. And as soon as I would wake up, I'd be wide awake, and I'd think, I'm going to look over at the clock, and it's going to say 3:00. And I would look over, and it wouldn't be 3:01, it wouldn't be 2:59, it would be 3:00. And I started doing that every single night for about 2 weeks, every night. And it really started to freak me out. And then I would lay there awake, and I would hear sounds in the house, so I'd get up and I'd look around, and and maybe there'd be a cabinet door open or something, and I got very disturbed by it. And so the scene in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, when Laura Linney wakes up at 3 a.m. and walks through her house and thinks she smells something burning, and then finds the door open, and it's a really scary scene, but nothing happens. That scene was just what happened to me. That was me just writing my own experience into that movie. And I did exactly what she did, which is I started turning my clock around. And so that when I would wake up, I just wouldn't look at it until eventually I stopped waking up, and then I was able to turn my clock around the proper direction again.
If you ever felt the need to bring in some heavy artillery, would you go to your Presbyterian pastor, or would you go to a Catholic priest?
Oh, I would probably go to a Catholic priest. I'd probably call Ralph Sarchi. He says his fellow cops always make fun of him and the stuff he does, and his answer is always, yeah, well, when a lamp flies across your room, I'm going to be the first person you call. That's what he always says.
There have been a lot of exorcism-related films in the 9 years since Emily Rose, and I know you keep up with the genre.
Yeah.
What did you want to do in this film that was different from what you did 9 years ago, or that was different from the other films that have been done in?
I mean, I think that the biggest thing for me was to create a tonally different movie. Deliver Us from Evil is a almost bizarre smashing together of different kinds of movies, and that was what was interesting to me about it, what made me want to do it. Because in the way, like Emily Rose was a courtroom demon possession film, and it kind of classically followed the structure of both of those movies at the same time, and as a result, it's like a pure courtroom movie, and it's pure demon possession horror film, and they simultaneously work. And in this movie, it's a much messier mashup, and it's a police procedural, and it's not a possession film. You're not watching, the girl get oppressed and then get all twisted up, like we have scenes, since Emily Rose. Getting twisted up, I guess, is part of being possessed now, or the paranormal movies, this sort of gradual increase of activity within one's home. There's none of that. It's not. It's different. It's cops on working cases, and so it's the mashup of the police procedural, the supernatural thriller, some genuine shock and horror in moments, even though I think it's probably more supernatural thriller than even horror, and then like big action scenes. There's a 4-minute knife fight in the movie, and some even humor in there, and some dramatic scenes. And I think it was the desire to delve into this particular material and play around with all of those things in one movie that was probably the most interesting to me, because they're all things that we love in movies, and I wanted to make a single movie that moved that way, because I thought it would make the movie very unpredictable as you're watching it, and would offer kind of high impact experience that would not be like something you've seen before. And you may not like the target that I hit, but I hit the target I aimed for in that regard. I mean, and so far the mainstream audiences that we've tested the movie with love it, and it works for them.
Obviously, as a filmmaker, you're always trying to evoke a sense of credibility, of plausibility, of getting the audience to buy into the film, whether or not they happen to personally believe in the supernatural and so forth. And the fact that you believe in it and your audience might not is not necessarily an issue. Do you think at all about the line, though, between what is the kind of thing that really happens and what is, Hollywood? Are there things in your film that you're aware of that you're doing because it's a movie and you don't necessarily think, well, this is the kind of thing that could really happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it, but I, like all filmmakers, am crossing that line aggressively all the time. The best film that will ever be made in this genre is the original Exorcist, and it crosses it,
Sure.
extremely, aggressively. And I think that audiences know that. I don't think anybody's necessarily looking for something that is as limited as reality when they're going to see this type of picture. But I'm always aware of where that line is in my own mind. And I like what I like the comment that you made about where my faith and belief is, and it's kind of irrelevant to where the audiences might be, because if you're doing it right, you're not asking the audience to buy into your point of view at all. If you're doing it right, you're asking the audience to accept the character's point of view as the character's point of view, and that can be anything. We've all watched no matter who we are, we've all watched hundreds of movies from characters' points of view who have beliefs about the world that are not our own, and yet we go into them because the story demands it, and that's how we end up experiencing the movie, and that's what part of the gifts that movies give us. And so what I'm never trying to do is I'm never trying to impart the way I understand the world or my view of the world, especially my view of controversial religious issues. I'm never trying to propagate that or impart that on the audience. I am interested in representing characters who think about these things in ways that are truthful and realistic. Priests and pastors are the most stereotyped characters in film and television, but not for the reasons that I think a lot of conservatives think. I think a lot of conservatives think that that's an anti-religious agenda. I don't think that's the case. I just think that most writers and directors in Hollywood don't know any priests and pastors, and I've known a lot, and a lot of them, in the movies, they tend to be sanctimonious or hypocritical, and a lot of priests and pastors that I've known are those things, but the most intelligent, decent people I've ever met in my life are priests and pastors. For a person to dedicate their life to the service of others and to do it authentically, they're still not perfect, and so I'm interested in representing some of those people because I've known some of them. That's not me trying to propagate my religious point of view. That's me sharing my knowledge of the human race and being able to bring a non-stereotypical character like Father Mendoza in this movie, to the screen.
I was just going to say, you've certainly created a priest character here who does not fit into that stereotype or really any other stereotype.
Yeah.
Where did he come from?
I owe a lot to Edgar Ramirez, the actor who played him, for the depth of quality of that character, because here's how that character was built. It's kind of an interesting story. The real Ralph Sarchie had two mentors. One of them was a bishop of an archdiocese here, and he was an actual exorcist, and that's who trained Ralph in what he does, and Ralph was his assistant in the exorcisms that had been authorized to take place here in New York. Malachi Martin, who wrote the harrowing book Hostage to the Devil, read at your own risk, scariest book I've ever read. He is a Catholic priest who was Ralph's other mentor, and so the two of them, in the first draft, I sort of blended it into one character, and then having written that in 2003, then when I came back and read the script, I was like, I just don't want to write the same, old Irish priest, demon hunting guy, and this is before Pope Francis. I just decided, what we really need is it needs to be a Latin American priest, because there's a kind of, at least in white America, there's a kind of religious baggage that falls away when you're talking about a Latin American priest. There's a cultural acceptance, that people are not going to be harsh on that. So I wrote him that way. Went after Edgar. He was the only person I went after for the role, and he read it and he passed in the character. And I said, he passed in the script. He said the movie could be great, but there's not enough there. And I said, well, let's have lunch and talk about it. And so we sat there at lunch for 4 hours one day in Beverly Hills, and what really opened it up for me was him starting to talk about a Jesuit that he knows in Venezuela, a good friend of his who's a Jesuit priest and who had struggled with addiction in his past, and which was instrumental in him converting and becoming a priest, and who had made mistakes even as a priest, who was very human. And as we started to talk about the role that guy had played in Edgar's life, I thought that's what I want. That's where this whole idea that Mendoza says that a saint is not a moral exemplar, a saint is a life giver, and that this man who had dedicated his life to helping people, to giving life to people. I was really interested in trying to write a character like that. And when I left that, I was not sure I was going to make the movie. And when I left that lunch, I called my agent and said, I'm definitely making this movie. And they said, oh, great, so Edgar's going to do it? I said, no. but he made me see how to make it work and why the movie will work, because I suddenly felt excited about writing that character and excited about representing him that way. And as Edgar and I continued to work on it, what became most interesting, because the movie never says it, it's a pure subtext, but it's always there, is that we said, this is not a guy who sees himself as the exorcist warrior who's out there battling demons. He's not the demon hunter. He's not the demon slayer at all. He's out there helping people. He didn't care about the demons. He knows this is what can help people. And so he's doing this to try to release and liberate the individual. And that's why the power of the ending of the movie is seeing a person come back to themselves. And I like that. I just like the idea of the unconventional, unstereotypical qualities, and yet a true priest, a man who's dedicated himself to the service of God and others, and he's doing it with integrity and intelligence, because I've known those people.
One thing that making the character Latino gives you is during the exorcism scene, he starts out doing the rite in English.
Yeah.
And at a certain point he switches over to Spanish. Yeah. Spanish is a Romance language. It's not Latin, but it gives you something that some exorcism movies that are set in the post-Vatican II era don't have. Do you think that there is not necessarily a spiritual power, but at least a cultural power to Latin? Do you think that the use of a language other than the language of everyday life has something special to it?
I think that there is particular spiritual power in each language, and in words in general. And I think that Latin in its antiquity and longevity has a particular density of power, and even spiritual power. And I think Spanish has. I think all human language has its own. I studied Spanish enough to have actually spoken it at one time. I've really lost almost all of it now, but I do. I think that language, not just in whether it's a Romance language or not, and not just in the more sort of common perception of how a language sounds or feels, but words themselves are magic things. They're magic things. In the beginning was the Word, and I'm very fascinated by the idea that words themselves are more than we think they are, and so with Edgar doing that, I felt it. It wasn't in the script initially that way, of course, and it was him who wanted to do that, and he really helped me build. We had the ritual in front of us, we had prayers in front of us, and he was very specific about where he wanted English and Latin and Spanish, and in the scene in the basement he sings a ritual prayer, which was a complete surprise to me. I didn't know he was going to do that.
That was a great moment.
It was a great moment, and my goodness, you should have been on set when it happened. I mean, it just shocked everyone because no one knew he was going to do it, including Chris Coy, the actor who plays Jimmy, and he responded to it beautifully. And it was just something that Edgar was carrying in his hip pocket. He had found that ritual prayer online, and when he did it, it was really pretty awesome.
Suppose that you were talking to a timorous moviegoer who hadn't seen any horror films, was interested in some of the kinds of things you were saying about what horror can do for us. Are there any movies other than, The Exorcism of Emily Rose or Deliver Us from Evil? Any movies that you might point them toward or possibly warn them away from? Or would you just say, look, you've gotten this far in your life without watching them, maybe it's not the genre for you?
Well, there are movies that I think, there are horror films that I think non-horror fans tend to like, and it also depends on how you define that term. I've never met anybody who regrets seeing The Sixth Sense. It's scary. It's got ghosts in it. But it's a very soft, beautiful, kind of movie. But when you're talking about something that really, I think qualifies as horror, I do know that a lot of people who don't watch horror, especially people of faith who've seen Emily Rose, like it. And I think that the same is true, weirdly, of The Exorcist. Like Jerry Bruckheimer doesn't watch horror films. He doesn't like them. He likes The Exorcist. He doesn't watch horror films. He doesn't like to be scared, but he loves the scariest movie ever made. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And what it really comes down to is that they don't like crap. Can I say that? They don't like bad movies. They don't like they don't like movies that are really playing more on exploitation. So I would say if I was going to start somebody out in the genre with something that's definitely a horror film to test the waters, I would probably pick Juan Antonio Bayon's The Orphanage, Spanish language film. Beautifully made movie, incredibly emotional, touching, relevant, serious things being dealt with in that movie about grief and human processing, and very frightening in places, but the reward of the whole experience is so deep and so rich. And if you watch something like that and don't feel rewarded by it, you should never watch another horror film. But if you do, then just know that there are movies like that out there. Everybody should be a discerning viewer. And that's a movie I would feel comfortable recommending to almost anyone.
In a lot of movies that deal with evil, and not necessarily just horror movies, sometimes it feels as if the powers of darkness are much closer at hand than the powers of light. It feels like, the devil is just around the corner, but God is somehow remote, somehow far away. When you look at your movies and when you approach this genre, where do you see God?
I mean, are you saying in the movie itself that I'm making?
Yeah.
Depends on the movie. Sinister is a movie that exists in a kind of spiritual vacuum. It doesn't end well at all, and I think, and I say a spiritual vacuum, meaning there's really very little light shining through anybody or anything that happens in that movie. What it has is tremendous moral focus. There's a lot of moral focus in that movie. That movie came from a deeply personal place of moral inquiry about of myself in my own life. If I wasn't being critical and trying to deeply evaluate things about my own moral thought and feeling and behavior, I never would have written that movie. But it just happened to coalesce with a story that I felt needed to exist in a godless universe, in a way, and I think there's a real place for those stories. Jesus told stories like that, that end with the main character of his tale cast into outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. End of story. It doesn't mean that all stories should be that way, or that even most stories should be that way. But those kind of tales shake us. They shake us into an observational mode that we otherwise wouldn't go into. In the same way that real life horror and real life pain and suffering shakes us into an observational mode about ourselves and the rest of the world that we otherwise wouldn't go into. To do that is a thing I take very seriously. So that was a choice I made. I'm glad I made it. Don't want to do that every time. But I think if it's done well, a movie like that can have a deeper, more resonant effect than any other kind of horror film. Because of the territory that you're dealing with.
Well, thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. Great interview.
Great to talk to you.
Yeah.